Hi, welcome back to Chapter 8 of Genesis as we continue through the flood story. Unfortunately, we're past the time when the waters are rising and God has remembered Noah and the animals in the ark, and the waters have receded, and the ark is landed in the mountains of Ararat, and now the drying continues. And in this section today from 8:6 to 14, we encounter a number of images that are probably very familiar to anybody who is engaging this video, but certainly even to almost anybody in the world. The dove and the olive tree, olive branch, olive leaf, as the case may be, as symbols of peace. But are they? And do they come from this story? We're going to have to explore more deeply to see that, whether that's true or not. So let's start with, as we've been doing, looking at the context of this story in relation to how it was written and where it comes from in relation to other cultures. We've been exploring here this traditional separation of Genesis 6:9 into the J, or as it's sometimes called now, non-P versions and P versions. And sometimes, as we've seen, that makes a big difference. It looks like two different stories, and sometimes not so much. Like today, for example, we can see that according to traditional understanding, 8:6, this first verse here, is part of the J tradition, but then 8:7, missing there, is part of the P tradition. That's about the raven. And then the dove part is understood to be about the P tradition again, and then it goes down to the J version for the counting of the days and months at the end. Is it necessary to see it that way? As I can show you here, and we'll look at it in more detail, it's very easy to shape this entire section as a consistently chiastic frame here. If you're not familiar with chiasm, we've looked at it a number of times. As you can see here, it involves an A and an A prime parts that mirror in some way. That's the blue parts here. And then the green parts that are inside that, and then a center part, C. And we're also looking at the bigger picture of chiasm of this entire structure, as I'll show you in a second. But I bring this up now at the beginning just to highlight that it isn't necessarily the only way to read this, as every time we see a difference that it means a different author. It's very possible to read this as these are consistently from the same author. And as we'll see, perhaps the raven element of this has a surprising contribution to one of the themes we've been looking at, which is here, echoes of Genesis 1 in the flood. We've been looking throughout at how many echoes there are. First of the deconstruction on the uphill side, so to speak, with the waters rising, and now the recreation of the downhill side, starting with 8:1, and God made the wind blow over the earth. And you see there's a big skip that doesn't include our section today from 8:1 to 8:17 and then to 9:1, where we see explicit echoes. And perhaps that's because the authors have offered us a sly way to have Noah participating in the recreation, and that has to do with the raven, which we'll get to in just a minute. Another aspect we've been looking at is the use of unusual language here. And so you can see in 8:11 there are two words, in 8:12, 13, 14, all words that are uniquely used in Genesis in the flood story. And I actually found another one that's not in this chart while I was preparing this video. So it keeps expanding as I keep looking a little more closely at it. Another thing we're going to look at, and I'll bring it up now, is the work here of Walter Moberly. And here you can see what he looks like, a professor and an Anglican priest in England, and his piece on why did Noah send out a raven, and I'll be referring to that as we go, offering, if not an answer, at least an interesting aspect of what's going on here in this story with two birds. And so in the flood story, again, you can see in the larger chiasm that we've been following, the E prime part is where we are now, 8:6 to 14. And if you can see just above in the purple section, which is from Casuto's way of shaping this into two sets of 6 paragraphs, he divides it a little bit differently so that 8:1 to 14 is all part of one unit, but we're still in that section, the end of the flood. And then in the Wenham version up here, he also sees 8:6 to 14 as one unit. So no argument there about what section we're in as we look at this. So let's have the Hebrew up here a little bit as we explore, and then we'll come back and look at that overall structure. So at the end of 40 days, and we've heard 40 days several other times, as I've noted throughout this, the number 40 is a standard pregnancy number based on 40 weeks in the sense of before and after the 40 represents a social or individual transformation. In this case, a transformation of God's relationship with humanity and the rest of creation. So at the end of those 40 days, Noah opened the window. We didn't know the ark had a window. The Hebrew here, chalon, is only here in the story and only one other time in the entire Pentateuch, let alone in Genesis, although it's used a number of times in the Hebrew scripture. As we'll see, it matches chiastically with the covering in 8:13 that we'll get to. But we hadn't known there was a window. Is it like a porthole? It certainly is not expected to be glass in the ancient world, and certainly the primeval world that the authors are picturing here couldn't have imagined having glass. And it certainly would hardly be like to withstand the force of the flood, and that would ruin the whole thing if the water came flooding in there. So whatever we understand halon to be, as some kind of porthole opening, Noah is able from the inside to open it, which perhaps conflicts with the fact that we saw that it said God shut them into the ark, but here he's able to open it and send birds out from it. Maybe it's only a big enough hole to allow a bird to go out. And so let's look at this a little more closely, because the raven and the dove issue both bring up much about the text, but also a lot about readers imposing their own views on it. For example, it's not surprising, it is surprising, but it's not sadly infrequent to see, in even relatively recent scholarship, to see a very racist view of this, that the raven is somehow black and that makes it evil, and the dove is somehow white and that makes it pure. But nothing is said about that anywhere here. Raven, the word for raven here, orev, is certainly described as a quote-unquote unclean bird, one of the animals that Noah was supposed to bring on the ark, according to the so-called J non-P version of a pair of unclean birds. But unclean doesn't mean it's evil. Unclean means don't eat it. And to this day, we don't know too many people that eat crows or ravens. So it doesn't mean it's bad or should be stayed away from. It's just an instruction not to eat it. And there are certainly many animals that are described in Leviticus as unclean, that humans hang out with and do things with, and aren't symbols of evil or darkness. So there's certainly nothing here about the color that suggests that's what's being brought up here. What's more likely at issue is the echoes from the Babylonian story. So as we've been seeing here, there are many parallels between Gilgamesh Tablet 11 and Genesis 6 and 9. In this case, the specifically sending out of ravens and doves. In the Gilgamesh epic, the dove is sent first and the raven second. What does that mean for us? Does it mean that our Genesis authors are slavishly following their source? Plainly not. In fact, as we'll see in the summary I do at the end of this sequence of close-ups of the small sections, and you can see even from just glancing at the theological contrast underneath the list of parallel images and elements, that the Genesis authors are telling a similar story with a very different purpose, a very different understanding of who the gods are, who in this case the one God is, in relation to people and creation, than in the Babylonian story. It's a counter story. It's not affirming that story, it's a counter story. But certainly the raven and the dove would bring that to mind in the cultural context and be familiar. And as we'll see, the symbolism that perhaps you as viewers or readers of the Bible have associated with these animals is curiously not from the Bible, but from elsewhere, as we'll see. So let's look now at this shape so we can see more of how this goes as we follow it in here. So what I want to highlight is the role of the two different birds and what we see all in this A section. So here we have in verse 7 the sending of the raven, and as my note is suggesting there, just what I was just saying to you. So sent out here, the verb here, shalach, and the PL, that's one of the stems in Hebrew that distinguishes the meaning of it. Here, according to Casuto, means to send away, as opposed to the qual, which signifies sending on a mission. For the intention was to let the birds go free. That's certainly his sense of it, that the raven is being sent out to be liberated from the ark. But that's only one way to look at it, and as we look more closely at the language, perhaps with Moberly's help, we can see something else. So it says here, it went, according to the New RSV, went to and fro until the waters were dried up from the earth. And it's a very unusual grammatical form here, and that's what we want to focus on. I'm not going to bore you or try to overwhelm you with the linguistic details of Hebrew grammar, but as Moberly notes in my quote below, the precise sense of this Hebrew idiom is not entirely clear, but the idea may be continuance. That is, the raven kept flying out and back, or it may be the simultaneousness or quasi-simultaneousness of a second action. Please excuse my typos there. I.e., the raven went out just to come back again soon. And then he notes the similar construction in verse 3a and 5 above, which let's go back to, which is about the waters gradually receding there in verse 3, as you can see, and the continuing to abate. So some process of continually going back and forth that gives us our first clue that something is going on here more than just a failed attempt. And the description that it's until the waters were dried up also needs us to look more closely. And again, Moberly can help us here. He notes here, and I'll just show you his whole quote. Noah's act of sending out the raven, therefore, is a kind of imitation of God. It explains why the raven continues to fly until the ground is entirely dry, for the action of God must be symbolized until it is complete and human life upon the earth can be resumed. Note that that's in relation to sending out the Ruah, the Spirit, echoing chapter 1, verse 2, as we saw early on. So in 8:1, as we saw, I'll bring it up so you can see it again here, that God remembered and God made a wind blow across the earth. And that's echoing the original God's Spirit back in chapter 1 of Genesis. But here, it's Noah having the raven do it. And what Moberly's point is that in this second attempt at creation, this recreation, God is ceding to humans some of the responsibility for keeping creation and the Spirit in the order that God wants it. Perhaps that's subtle, and it might not be, quote, the real or original purpose, but I think it provides something of an explanation that takes account of both the language and the symbolism according to the Genesis readers and the Mesopotamian views, as opposed to later Christian rereadings of this in light of other traditions, as we'll see in a moment. So the raven will continue to go back and forth even while the dove is going out. It's not a matter of the raven goes out, comes back, and then God sends Noah. The raven continues to go back and forth across the waters until this entire scene is over. And we don't know, the text doesn't say why Noah sent the raven out. It just says sent the raven out and then it went. And then we see something different here. So we don't know how long it was that the raven was out before Noah chooses to send the dove out. But he sent the dove out from him, which is a very unusual phrase we'll get to in just a second. The word for dove is Yonah in Hebrew. Jonah, like the prophet Jonah, whose name means dove. And as you can see from my note down below, these are references to other uses of doves in the Hebrew Bible. Nowhere in the Hebrew Bible is the dove associated specifically with peace or gentleness or anything like that, other than in the New Testament where Jesus suggests to being gentle as doves. But certainly the New Testament view of that from Matthew's Gospel is not what the authors of Genesis had in mind here. So let's look just briefly at the Hebrew scripture references to doves, as you can see there. Several times in Isaiah, it's a metaphor for sorrow. The sound of doves described as moaning, understood to be a metaphor, like in the Prince song when doves cry. There are also some examples of just simply the action of doves as birds, like nesting on hillsides. In those examples you can see. In one example, they're described as senseless. I'm not sure what compared to, but comparing humans to doves is just like we compare humans to many animals to say that they're not very smart, relative to humans at least. And then in the Song of Songs, it's a common term of endearment from the male speaker to the female. But is it something specific about doves? If we get too specific about animals in the Song of Songs and human bodies, we'll go a long way out of our way here. So that's a little survey of doves in the Hebrew Bible, and nothing about that associates doves with peace or anything like that, and we'll see in a moment where that comes from. The phrase from him here, which is technically a form of the standard object marker, just a little word that is usually not pronounced in Hebrew, and I won't get into the details of that. But it's an unusual word here to express specifically in the third person male singular, male possession, but it's intensified here, and that's what we hear in the Hebrew, or in the English rather. Then he sent out the dove from him. Not from the ark, but from him, like it's his personal dove. That's echoing a little bit what we saw in 8:1, that all the animals in the ark were with Noah. In that sense, it's almost certainly that he's taking care of them, echoing the positive part of Genesis 1, that God made humans to have stewardship over the animals, and certainly God's instructions for the ark are for Noah to have stewardship over the animals while they're on the ark, to feed them and take care of them. But somehow the idea that they're his personal animals, the dove in particular here with this intensified form, is an unusual thing. So he sends it out for the mission to see if the waters has subsided, but literally become small. And as we saw in the rising waters, there were a series of words that describe the swelling and increasing of the waters in a poetic way. And we saw in the receding of the waters last video, and also a series of poetic words. Similarly here, I'm not going to focus on it so much in this video because we're looking at ravens, doves, and in a moment olive branches. But to highlight again a new set of words here, again, as I showed you already, unique in Genesis to the flood story. In this case, this is not a unique word. It'll be used a number of times, as you can see in chapter 12 and 16. But if the waters had become small from the face of the ground, from the Peni Ha'adamah. And that's one of the things I want to draw attention to, the chiastic shape on the right side here, is that you can see in this A part, there's an alternation of three ways of describing the alternation of the water with something else. The earth or the ground. The earth Ha'eretz or the ground Ha'adamah here. And notice in the A part, it's Ha'eretz, Adamah, and Ha'eretz in order, and then in the A prime part, the same thing, Ha'eretz, Adamah, and Ha'eretz. Those are usually not understood as referring to separate authors, that there's no J and P specification that Adamah is one and Eretz is another. They both use both. And like ground and earth, we have many words in English to refer to that. We could also say soil and topsoil and dirt and all kinds of other things. But the fact that it's shaped in this ABA little mini chiasm within the chiasm is almost certainly not a coincidence, matching one part to the end, as we'll see. So he sent out the dove to see if the waters had dried, but the dove found no place to set its foot. Literally no resting place for its foot, which you can see Manoach here is one of the many plays on the name Noah. So as Wenham renders it playfully, she looked for another Noah outside the ark, but finding none, she returned to the Noah she knew. And that's playful, but that's in Wenham's language, much like the rabbinic midrash has fun with these things. And so returned to him in the ark, shav, the verb for returned, which often means returning to God, or returning in the sense of interior, a return like metanoia in Greek, a changing of mind and heart that turns oneself back to the Lord, back to God. Here it's returning back to the ark, for the waters were still on the face of the whole earth, following our structure there. So he put out his hand and took it with him and brought him into the ark with him. And as Wenham suggests, a little homiletically, it shows the sort of relationship that ought to exist between man and the animal world, which will be broken up, as we'll see, in God's follow-up, where the dread of humans is put on the animals. And there aren't too many wild birds that'll land on human hand these days, are there? In our area, we have camp robbers, but maybe you don't have something like that in your area. So he waited another 7 days. There's no specific reason given why he's waiting another 7 days, but as you can see, that matches the two B parts of the chiasm on the right side. And he sent out the dove again from the ark, and the dove came back to him in the evening, Erev here, for evening, or the beginning of the day in the Hebrew sense of daytime. And there in its beak, and notice there's a vehenna here, a behold, that's so often we've seen left out for some reason by the translators. And behold, there in its beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf. A few things to look at there. The word for freshly plucked, taraf, which is from the Arabic originally, and it's only one other place in the entire Hebrew Bible, although there are a couple of variations on it. Olive, this is the first time olive, zayeth, is mentioned in the Bible, only here in Genesis, but 38 times olives are in the Hebrew Bible, and there are a lot of olives in the New Testament as well. But what it is a leaf, not a branch. So if we were picturing in your mind an olive with a dove, with an olive branch in its mouth, that's not what we see here. We see an olive leaf. In Hebrew, it's Allah, and there are a number of other words for branches, and none of those used in Hebrew, and none of those are used here. You can see those down there, and I won't go through all of those. But those are other words that are used to refer to olive branches, and that's not the word used here. The Septuagint also uses a Greek word for leaf, so there was no confusion among the original authors of whether this was a branch or a leaf. So why do we associate it with an olive branch? Curiously, the symbol of the olive branch is not biblical this way. Olive branches are symbolic in the Hebrew Bible as a messianic symbol, and we won't get into that now, but not as a symbol of peace. The olive branch as a symbol of peace comes from the Aeneid. From Virgil. High on the stern Aeneas his stand, and held a branch of olive in his hand. While thus he spoke, the Phrygians' arms you see, expelled from Troy, provoked in Italy. by Latian foes with war unjustly made, at first affianced and at last betrayed, this message bear the Trojans and their chief, bring holy peace and beg the king's relief. So that's the original image of an olive branch as an expression of peace from Roman culture. And you can see it here from this coin from the Roman times of an olive branch as a symbol there. So the adaptation into it being a Christian symbol is taking it not from Genesis, but from the Roman culture, despite the fact that if you go to many websites or if you just search for where is the olive branch a symbol of peace from, they will wrongly attribute it to Genesis 8:11, even though, as I've just shown you, it does not say olive branch at all there. Curiously, a way that it found its way into Christian tradition is via the Latin writer Tertullian, writing in the late 2nd, early 3rd century, and he links it with baptism, and you see here in this quote, "For just as after the waters of the deluge, by which the old iniquity was purged, after the baptism, so to say, of the world, a dove was the herald which announced to the earth the assuagement of celestial wrath, when she had been sent her way out of the ark and had returned with the olive branch, a sign which even among the nations is the foretoken of peace." So that from Tertullian. So he acknowledges right in that quote that the olive branch is a sign that, quote, even among the nations, which is to say the Romans, that he's a part of even as he resists them, is a symbol of peace. But he wrongly takes the Genesis text as implying an olive branch, which it doesn't. And it also doesn't say anything about it being a symbol of peace. In fact, what it's a symbol of is that the water dried. So later associations of the dove with peace are simply attributing them, taking the Roman element, and then sometimes connecting that, as we know from the Gospels, with the Holy Spirit and Jesus' baptism coming down like a dove, or in Luke's Gospel, bodily like a dove. But even there, it doesn't say it's a sign of peace. It's more of a sign of the Holy Spirit. So just trying to unpack a little bit of what happens when we read these stories, not as closely as we can. We look at the actual language. And the confirmation of that is what follows here in verse 11. Because once the dove comes back with the olive leaf, Noah knew that the waters had subsided, had become small, fulfilling that there. So that's clearly the purpose. He doesn't, what Noah knows here isn't that God has forgiven people or that peace has broken out, but simply that there is dry land that is now growing leafy things again. So just to be sure, he waits another days and sent out the dove, and this time it didn't return to him, and so that tells him that the dove has a place to build a nest and find a home, and we're approaching the end of the story here. And in the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, as our P author has often wanted to highlight this, the waters were dried up from the earth, using a different word only here in Genesis, harvu, and behold, they were dry. And then Noah removed the covering of the ark. This is not the same as the window, but notice how it's parallel here. Opened the window of the ark up here and removed the covering of the ark. Again, we weren't told there was any covering on mikshah here, and that's one of those words that I left out of my uniquely here in Genesis in the flood story, and also I'll put that in and put up the third version of Hebrew words found in only the flood story. And yet another vahana, and behold. So we've seen a whole number of these, which is not surprising, because it's a behold moment. And behold, there is life. The waters have dried. The land is habitable by birds and now by humans again. And Noah could see it. The face of the ground was drying. Notice the same word there, but different here in 14. In the second month, on the 27th day of the month, so as to say that after Noah first removed the covering, he stays for another month and 27 days and finds the earth is a different word here, yeshiv, only verse 7 and here in verse 14. Matching that. So as we look at our chiasm here to bring this to a conclusion, we can see how what we see in this section is not only the drying, but Noah's participating in this process. In the first part, Yahweh or God put them in, gave them commands, and now Noah is participating in the process of opening the ark and bringing the animals out and participating in the process of re-inhabiting the earth. First by opening the windows, sending out the raven as a symbol of the Spirit, not as a symbol of evil or anything terrible, but as a symbol of the Spirit over the waters until the ground is dry and creation begin to form again. And that's where we'll pick it up next time. See you then.